I would love to introduce Sylvester Mobley. He is the founder and CEO of the youth tech education nonprofit Coded by Kids. Through Coded by Kids, Sylvester works to increase access to tech education opportunities for those who are underrepresented in tech, especially children of color. He works to ensure that every child has the support, resources, and opportunity to become the next generation of tech and innovation leaders. Sylvester believes that building a tech industry that is diverse, inclusive, and equitable is one of the most pressing issues our society faces. So I'm going to hand off to Dave. Let's get started.
Cool. Welcome everybody. Welcome Sylvester. I'm David Dolan Thomas, content strategy advocate here at Think Company and author of Design for Cognitive Bias. Sylvester, thank you so much for being part of this conversation.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Dave.
Sure. And just to get started, and to be fair, to get started on a pretty dour note, you and I had a conversation a little ways back, and you gave me a statistic. A while ago, you were kind of one of the first people to key me into the idea, which again I wasn't aware of, that generally speaking, Black families have a hard time holding on to wealth generation over generation. Wasn't something I was aware of. I knew there were fewer wealthy Black families, but I didn't realize there was this added layer of losing wealth. And then we talked not too long ago, you kind of doubled down on that. And you pointed out to me that there are more Black people falling into poverty than getting out of it again. So can you, clarify a bit about that statistic and maybe shed some light onto why that is?
Yeah. So, one of the things we talked about, and so this is interesting because we're now able to include a whole bunch of strangers in conversations that you and I have been
Yeah.
been having, which is good. If you take Black males as one example, 41% of Black males who grew up rich will end up either lower middle class or poor. So if you think about that number, you're talking about almost half of Black males who grew up rich who can't stay there, who are unable to maintain that socioeconomic status. It's not because they're underserved, and sometimes that's the conversation. The conversations around, well, the reason Black people are unable to move forward is because they're underserved, they're poor, whatever it may be. But they weren't moving backwards because they were underserved. They weren't moving backwards because they were poor. They were moving backwards because of the role that race plays and the impacts of race. When you look at those trends and you look at the downward economic pressure on Black families, and then look at programs that are targeted towards people who are below the poverty line, those programs aren't moving enough people up out of poverty into the middle class to balance out the number of Black families that are being pushed out of the middle class. So it just becomes, basic addition and subtraction. When people talk to me about, well, we're trying to address poverty, we're trying to solve poverty, my response is always, well, you've created an unsolvable problem. If you're hemorrhaging more people from the middle class than people who you're actually moving up, you can never solve poverty. So, we kind of have this approach that in itself is what's perpetuating poverty.
So what are some of the mechanics then? Like, where's that downward pressure coming from? Like, what's the story of someone, Black man born rich? What's happening in their life that now they're moving into lower middle class or poverty?
So there's a couple of things happening. One, Black people are currently concentrated in the jobs that have the highest likelihood of being replaced by automation. So if you think about a lot of the traditional middle class jobs that enabled Black people to move into the middle class and stay there, those jobs are now going away. Those jobs are now being replaced as a result of automation. And we haven't been able to make a shift quickly enough to say, okay, we need to get out of these sectors. We need to get out of these jobs and get into jobs that are going to survive automation. So as that happens, you have Black people who were in solid, good middle class jobs who are now trying to figure out, like, well, what happens, because this job isn't going to exist anymore. What adds to the problem is a lot of workforce development programs that are meant to prepare, people of color to move into the middle class and train them for careers are still training Black and brown people for those very same jobs that won't exist. I can remember having a conversation with someone who was running a workforce development program, and said, if you look at the list of jobs that you're targeting and match that up with a list of jobs that won't exist in 5 to 10 years, you're training people for jobs that aren't going to exist. So it's hard to make the case to me that you're helping those people. The other part of it is, even when you look at higher education, Black people are concentrated in the lowest paying college majors. And this is something, I talk to people about, because a lot of times people really get caught up in you have to help first gen college students, and if they're a first gen college student, they're the ones who need the help. One of the things I point out is, if you're a second or even third generation college student, but you're coming from a middle class Black family, so that, you're able to go to college, but your family doesn't have enough money to remove the aspect of student loans. You still have to go into debt for that college education. If you pick a low paying college major, you're graduating with an enormous amount of debt and a degree that has a very low return on its investment. Within that generation, you're sliding back socioeconomically. So you have all of these factors that are, coming together to put this downward pressure. There's been a ton of research on Black wealth. Like, we are moving in a direction where, it's estimated that we're going to have a zero in terms of net worth for Black families. Like, as these things all come together at the same time, it's putting a significant amount of downward pressure on Black families right now.
I mean, I can sing that, right? Like, I know, I went to college. I wasn't the first in my family to go to college, but I went to college and I took on a great deal of debt, and I did not have a major that was going to get me out of it. And it was like, basically the internet saved me, and I happened to luck into a job and a track that at least was going to let me break even. but yeah, and my college debt back in the 90s is nothing compared to the college debt that Black folks are and everyone's taken on now. So
Right.
the other thing I get curious about, though, is I don't know if you know anything about this, but like property, because that's the other thing I think about is like, the white wealth gets sustained often through passing down property, right? And I'm wondering if that's also, is that also complicated for Black folks? Are we not having the same ease with which to do that?
We are certainly not. And that's, a lot of times when I talk to people about the systemic racial barriers, people will say, well, racism was a long time ago, or not racism, slavery was a long time ago. And one of the things I say, and like usually I don't talk about slavery, I'll point to my parents' generation, I'll point to Jim Crow and say, like, well, you had redlining that created this system where Black families weren't able to buy homes in neighborhoods where property values were increasing. They weren't able to buy homes. They were forced into renting. That was one generation away from me. So, we're still dealing with the socioeconomic impacts of that. And a lot of people treat it as this far off thing, but that was happening when my parents were trying to buy a home. The neighborhood I grew up in Philadelphia, I grew up in that neighborhood because the neighborhood my parents originally wanted to buy a home in, when my mom was pregnant with me, they were discouraged because that neighborhood was, not welcoming of Black families. So you have these things happening, and then even if you talk about our generation, you talk about right now today, you have banks like Wells Fargo that right now today have had to pay fines because they were still found to be using discriminatory lending practices. So it's not as if, we moved past, the 60s and 70s and the problems went away. Like, it's still happening right now. So, if you have banks that are giving loans at higher interest rates based on race and things like that, like, it just makes it so much harder for Black people to acquire property and then the wealth and
Mhm.
equity that comes with it.
Yeah, and I feel like the analogy I hear that I find kind of sums it up well is, imagine you're playing a game at Monopoly, right? but you don't get to go for like 4 or 5 turns. And then you get to play, but all the good property's been bought up already. Right.
Right.
And people are like, what are you talking about? You can buy property just as much as anybody else. Hell, we'll even give it $200 to start.
Right. Right.
Right. Why can't you catch up?
Which is, at every level. You think about the school district of Philadelphia. The school district of Philadelphia gets a lot of grief, and people like really harp on the school district of Philadelphia is doing a bad job, and the school district of Philadelphia is failing at this and failing at that. The thing I try to help people understand and I try to point out is the school district of Philadelphia is dealing with a funding model that was designed based on race. During white flight, the state of Pennsylvania wanted to make sure that funding for education followed white families that were leaving cities. And we have a funding model that was intentionally designed to defund largely Black inner cities to fund white suburbs where white families were moving. No one ever fixed that funding model. So we're still dealing with a funding model that was intentionally designed based on race that has crippled Black school districts like the School District of Philadelphia. So when we're blaming the School District of Philadelphia, one of the things I say is, well, how about we fix the thing that we broke first and ensure that there's an equitable funding model? And then we can say the school district did, whatever, the school district is doing this. But it's difficult for me to place the blame at the feet of the school district when the school district is trying to deal with a system that was intentionally designed to cripple it.
Yeah, so I want to get back to something you were saying earlier about our approaches to solving poverty. I want to dig in a little more there. So, what are some of the shortcomings around how we're currently thinking about fixing poverty?
One of the biggest shortcomings I see is the focus on poverty. Poverty itself isn't the problem. Poverty is a symptom of the problem. Often we find ourselves, in this pattern of, it's almost like we're trying to treat cancer with painkillers, but never actually addressing the cancer. Poverty is just a symptom of the problem, but for a variety of reasons, we never really get into how do we actually address the problem. The other part to that is just, if you think about some of the things I was talking about earlier in the conversation with the downward pressure on middle class Black families, because we focus so much money and resources on people once they've gotten into poverty, we do almost nothing to help keep people in the middle class and help people in the middle class move up. So we have that unsolvable problem because the programs we have to help people in poverty, the reality is we're not moving a ton of people out of poverty. Like, that is just the simple reality. And more it's becoming harder and harder to move people out of poverty with the programs that we currently have. Until we're able to say we can't focus solely on people in poverty, we also have to focus on the middle class and keeping people in the middle class. We're never actually going to address poverty. Like, as long as you're hemorrhaging more people, as long as you have more people moving down than moving up, you can't actually solve it. So, then the question becomes, do we really want to solve it? Because someone once pointed out to me that there's organizations that make a lot of money in the city of Philadelphia based on poverty. So, it's like, well, do we actually want to solve poverty? Because if we do, then we're not going to solve it like this. So, I think that we have to start to look at it from a different perspective.
Well, you bring up a good point. Like, there's this moral hazard of gameplay, right? Where if you incentivize the wrong thing, you'll get the wrong behavior, right? I think about like quotas where it's like, oh, we're going to incentivize police officers by how many arrests they make. Well,
Right.
That's a scenario where if crime goes away, police are in trouble, right? Like, you don't want police to root for crime, and you don't want people solving poverty to root for poverty.
Right. Well, I mean, a story I often tell. Early on in my professional career, I worked in construction management and worked for a very interesting construction company that had a niche, and their niche was building prisons. So
Mm.
I have built prisons all over the country. The state of Pennsylvania was one of our clients. So, I did 6 prisons for the state of Pennsylvania. I would get frustrated because a large part of my time was spent on the road driving across the state out to the middle of nowhere. And I was always in the mountains of PA. And at one point, I was in a meeting and was like a little irritated because I had to drive to the middle of nowhere again and asked the question, why are we always building prisons in the middle of nowhere? Someone who worked for the state of Pennsylvania said, a lot of these towns were coal mining towns. And as the coal mines were shutting down, we needed a place for people to go to work. So we would build prisons so that the people who wouldn't be able to work at the coal mines anymore could then go work at the prison. That then means your economy for that town is based on that prison. So all of your incentive is to keep as many people in that prison as possible to keep that prison operating. Because if that prison is no longer operating, you now lose the economic lifeline for that area, which was, when you talk about the moral hazard, I felt like you've now created this perverse, tie between things. So it's like, well, of course we're going to keep putting people in prison because we need to support local economies.
Yeah, and that, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but you're now creating iteration number 150 of we are going to create an economy based on the incarceration of Black people.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Like, how many
Right.
different versions of that are we going to do? So I want to get back to something you were saying about, like, cancer, right? So if poverty is simply the symptom, well, what is the cancer? Like, what should we be treating?
So we should be treating the systemic inequity that's being driven by the systemic racism. And I'm going to point to the school district example again. It is very well understood that a lack of education has a lot of long-term impacts that will result often in someone ending up below the poverty line. Like we understand that. Like that's not a very like debatable thing. There's a lot of research into the role education plays. But we still allow a system that was intentionally structured based on race to exist. So the poverty, when we start talking about was poverty the problem, I would say, well, poverty isn't the problem. Poverty is the education system that has been created based on race. If we fix that education system and produce better educated people, we're then able to address, that aspect of the poverty issue. We have this interesting dynamic where if you look at the money that's spent between our criminal justice system, training programs, workforce development programs, things like that, we will spend more money after than we're willing to spend at the K to 12 education level, where we should be actually spending the money, because if we spend the money there, that then addresses a lot of the later issues. That's a really good example to me of like where poverty is just a symptom of our refusal to fix or change. Because I'm not going to say fix because the system is working the way it was designed to work, but our refusal to change a system that was designed to use funding as a way of crippling Black and brown people, our refusal to change that system then results in the poverty. So I don't care how much money you spend on poverty, we're not actually fixing the problem.
Now, is fixing the problem expensive? Because I'm thinking, like, because I agree, you often see very different versions of that, even in theoretically non-race related things like, disaster preparedness. Right? We just don't like thinking about things until they break. But I wonder, like, so what would what would that look like if we said, okay, we're going to fund differently, we're not going to spend on poverty anymore, we're going to not even fix it, we're going to create a new system? Like, what would be one of the concrete things we do that's like, yes, that is actually a different model altogether?
So one is taking a long-term approach, and being willing to invest and to actually spend. You think about Cheltenham, which is like right next to Philadelphia, spends more than $4,000 per child than Philadelphia does. Being willing to actually invest in long-term solutions. Unfortunately, we do this thing with Black and brown children in Philadelphia, where we treat the 10, 11, 12-year-old child like the unemployed 31-year-old adult. And we have this very short term, how can we get them into a job as quickly as possible mentality. We do a poor job at preparing them for higher education and things like that. And then, I'll see people throw their hands up and, we say, well, higher education isn't for everyone. It's like, well, maybe not, but, you just made a decision not to prepare this kid for a higher education. And now you're saying it may not be for them. We have to be willing to actually invest in long-term, real solutions for Black and brown children, which we just haven't been willing to do. Everything has been very short-term thinking. If we can get them into a job and they're not on public assistance, we've won. I think that's a very sad way of looking at it. It's a very sad approach.
This seems like a good point to bring up One Philadelphia, because it seems like that's your attempt to start to think more long-term. Can you tell me what that is and kind of how it works?
One Philadelphia is a collaborative effort where Coded by Kids, as an organization, we sit at the center point of a lot of different organizations and sectors. Just because of the work that we do, we sit at a center point that's very unique for a nonprofit organization. So we essentially said, hey, because of the center point that we sit at, because we work with government, we work with startups, we work with large tech companies, we work with community organizations. What does it look like if we all came together? We would play the role of how do we connect, how do we bring people together, and how do we push this forward? And all of us work to move in one direction. All of us work to move underrepresented people into truly sustainable career opportunities that have the ability to give them long-term growth potential, long-term growth opportunities. How do we actually all work together to stop doing the short-term thinking? How do we all work together to say, how do we move as many underrepresented people into the tech and innovation space as possible? And I am admittedly focusing on tech and innovation. I am concentrating on that. I'm doubling down on that, partly because when you look at things like the jobs that are being replaced by automation, the jobs that are going to survive automation are the ones that are in the tech and innovation space. Those are also the jobs that have the ability to move people up socioeconomically faster. Like, it's hard to argue that there's a space that can move people socioeconomically faster than the tech and innovation space. And I also say, like, hey, Black people are already concentrated. We're just concentrated in the wrong spaces. So let's just shift that concentration now to spaces that we know have real upward mobility and opportunity. And how do we do that together? So Coded by Kids is pulling everyone from funders to program providers to community organizations to companies and saying, this is the direction we need to go in. We all have a role to play in moving in that direction. And we're willing to pull it all together and be the glue that binds this ecosystem and move everyone in the same direction. And do it in a way where we're focused solely on long-term outcomes. I've tried to make the point both to our funders, but also organizations that we work with. This isn't about short-term solutions. Like, if you're going to be a part of this, if you're going to commit to this, you have to commit to long-term, truly transformative change. That means the hard work that we've often been resistant to doing, but that's it's the ugly, difficult work that needs to happen. We can't think about this in months. We have to think about this in 5, 10, 15, 20-year increments. There's a conversation that often happens where, funder will say, okay, all right, you're working to address inequity. I'm going to give you funding for this year, and you're good, right? And I'm like, well, we're trying to address inequity. I don't think 12 months of funding can help fix inequity. I mean, like, it's only been here for how many hundreds of years. So it's one of those things where it's like, hey, you have to be willing to commit to long-term funding so that we can do the difficult work to drive real change. And we're going to be the glue that it needs. One of the problems we've had is, as a city, we've functioned in such a siloed way historically. It's always been a barrier to us doing anything large. But we're at a point, we're at a crossroad where it's either we're going to do that big, large, ambitious thing and try to move the city forward, or we just keep moving in the same direction we've been moving.
It's interesting you say that now, because as I think about that long-term approach, and obviously I'm thinking of this because of current events, but leading up to the election, I've been, anxiety, sure, but at the same time, a certain resoluteness to whoever wins, I pretty much know what I'm going to be doing. Like the types of projects I'm going to be involved in, the types of work I'm going to be doing. It might be much harder or much easier, depending on what happens. But there's that short. And what I actually find comforting about that long-term approach is, well, if I'm working on something that I'm not going to see the true results of for 20 years, even a presidential election isn't that big a deal. It'll affect my work, sure, but like it gives me like a time frame to really, I don't know, commit to. Have you found that, or have you found that people are resistant to, like, how are people reacting to the idea of thinking in 5, 10, 15-year terms?
So, it's a culture shift for the nonprofit and funding community. That's just not how the nonprofit and philanthropic community in Philadelphia has approached these issues. So I'm now saying, hey, let's approach this in a way that you haven't approached it before, which some people are able to say. And, some of our funders, said to me like, hey, we know you're right. We recognize that how this has worked in the past has been a problem. Other organizations that we're working with as partners have been able to say the same thing. Like, look, we get it. We know that this is how we need to do things. But there's also, unfortunately, stakeholders that, because this is the way it's always worked, there is a little bit of resistance or hesitation. There is a little bit of the like, whoa, that's a little too big. There's too many risks. And I had this conversation, with a funder, and I said, like, well, sure, it is risky, but what's the alternative? We do nothing and we keep moving in the direction that we're moving. Like, wouldn't you rather take the risk and see if we can potentially move in a better direction and just keep doing what we've been doing and move in the direction we've been moving? Like, I would rather take the risk. Like, it's just me. But we are asking people to shift the way that they have traditionally thought about some of these things.
Yeah, it reminds me of a story. I had a relative I think they were going to become a lawyer and a doctor, so like a JD PhD program that was going to take like 8 years. And his friends were like, "Are you crazy? 8 years?" And he was like, "The 8 years are going to pass anyway. Would I rather be a JD PhD at the end of it, or just me?"
Right. And I mean, but I had a conversation with someone on my team, and I was talking about like being very intentional with the younger people on the team about who we're grooming for leadership roles and how we're preparing people. And I said to her at one point, I said, well, you do realize, like, I'm not going to be the CEO of Coded by Kids forever. And the work we're doing, we're talking about 20, 30-year things that we're working towards. We need to be thinking today about who picks it up when I'm just too run down to do it anymore. And, we need somebody with a little more energy and, excitement than I have. But, we have to start thinking that way about like, hey, this isn't just about me. I have to know who I'm passing on the next 20 years to, when I'm, moving on. And that just isn't how we thought about these things.
Yeah, we're going to go to some audience questions in a minute, but I want to dig in a little bit more into this. So One of the things you said to me that I want to dig into a little more a while back was you once said that you can't solve disinvestment with more disinvestment. I want you to tell a little about the context of that statement, because I think that's a really a wise observation.
Right. So I'm gonna start that with a little story. My 5-year-old has been doing virtual kindergarten. So for almost every day for the last 2 months, she has sat at a little table next to my desk. And so she sat while she's done virtual kindergarten and listened to me on meetings and on calls, watched me. And I think at 5 years old, she probably has a better understanding of how running a nonprofit works than most adults I know. As she the other day was typing random numbers with dollar signs into her Google Doc that she had opened up and was yelling at me, "We got to get the money if we want to help people." And I'm looking at her, and I'm like, she gets it. Like she understands. Like she basically doing my job. I mean, like she's typing random numbers and dollar signs. Like she's doing my job right there. Like that is it. Um, I often have a conversation with companies that will say, "Well, we don't really want to write checks. We'll give you volunteers." And I'm like, "Well, the problems we're trying to address were problems that were created through intentional disinvestment. Your volunteers, like that's cool, but we can't solve inequity with volunteers. Like we can't solve inequity with more disinvestment. Like the only way to solve disinvestment is with investment that's just as intentional and deliberate as the disinvestment was."
So I want to give you, I want to ask you one more question before we go to the audience questions, specifically around, I want to hear some success stories. Like, what does this look like when it works?
When it works, what it looks like is because we take, within Coded by Kids, we take a long-term, you know, progressive developmental approach. We try to stay away from like the one-off, we're going to do this workshop. It's the one-off, we're going to do this short-term thing happens at the exposure level. And it's really meant to give a young person enough context to make a decision about whether they're going to move on or move forward or not. At that point, we're saying, okay, if you're committing to this, you're in. We're expecting you to be here over the course of the next however many years. We take a very similar approach that's taken in youth sports, where kids are being developed and prepared to play at the next level. We look at it the same way. So what that looks like when it actually plays out is two of our young men are currently working on a startup right now. So we're talking about a real startup. They're having real conversations about raising venture capital and how do they scale. They're doing, user interviews. Like this is not a small business. Like they're trying to build a high growth, scalable startup. Um, Both have been with us since high school. The CEO now goes to Wharton. The CTO goes to Drexel. They're both in their junior year. It's interesting because the CEO did an internship at Facebook last summer and decided he wouldn't do another internship at Facebook. He was offered to come back and do another internship and said, "I would rather work on the startup. I would rather try to gain as much traction in that time as I can." So to see two Black young men that were connected to each other through Coded by Kids, have been with us since high school, work for us, their college job is working in our development shop. So, we're also their employer, but also have the space and support that they need to start and build a startup. That is what it looks like when it works. They have mentors that we've been able to build around them. One of their mentors is a Black CEO of a venture-backed startup. Their other mentor is a CTO of a venture-backed startup. They have another mentor that's a CTO. Like to be able to push the number of people around them and say, we're going to basically create this whole support system that's here solely to make sure you're successful, and everything is going to get behind you to push you forward. Like that is that success, and seeing how that works out, that is what we we are working towards, that's what we ultimately want to see over and over.
Yeah, and I like the model of athletic career development, right? Because that's something that starts in like peewee. You've got like insane parents who are like, "Oh yeah, this kid, I'm taking this softball very seriously because I'm expecting this guy's going to be in the major leagues," and that is a 20-year arc, right? That they're committing to. But there's a whole very well financed infrastructure, right, to get you from point A to point B.
I mean, so if you think about it, if you think about the money and stakes involved in the tech and innovation space, I would argue that the stakes and money are just as high as the stakes and money involved in sports. So why don't we take the same approach? Why don't we use the same mechanisms and the same systems? When you think about what's the most effective mechanism at producing Black and brown high level talent, it's sports, it's athletic development. So why don't we just use the same approach to produce high level Black and brown talent in tech and innovation? To me, it's, it was a no brainer. Like, why wouldn't we just do the same thing?
Yeah, you don't hear anyone complaining about a pipeline problem in the NFL.
Right. Because right. There is no pipeline problem in the NFL. Yeah.
So I'm going to throw to Alina now. Alina, do we have any questions yet from the audience?
We've got a ton of questions.
Awesome.
I will get started with the first one. It has a few upvotes. It's anonymous, so I'm going to go ahead and read it. What's the most impactful thing that local tech companies specifically can do to help address inequity?
So what I usually start with, and I always start with this because I'm the CEO of a nonprofit. So I always start with write checks. And it goes back to we're trying to address intentional disinvestment. And we need everyone in the community writing checks to address the intentional disinvestment. Outside of that, I encourage people to get politically engaged and politically active. A lot of what we're contending with are policies that were designed that people have just decided not to change. If we had critical mass, if we had every tech company and every startup in the city of Philadelphia pushing against Harrisburg to change the funding model for the state of Pennsylvania, if we had every tech company in the city of Philadelphia pushing on their elected officials to change the education funding model, that would be a very powerful stick to drive change. So I encourage things like that, like get politically active, use the voice that you have, use the power that you have to push on our elected officials.
Yeah, and to that point, I mean, just this election, Prop 22 in California, you see what tech companies can do when they decide they want to get policy, push through some really nasty stuff, but they coalesced. So yeah, tech companies can get political stuff done, have no doubt.
Right. Yep.
As Hannah says, boom. Okay, the next question is, and I'm so sorry if I mispronounce your name. I'm very much accustomed to that as a lifestyle, but I think it's pronounced Husna. So I will unmute you and have you ask your question.
Sorry, my friend is here with me and she started laughing. It's Husna, but it's okay.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, my question was, what types of jobs are being replaced by automation? I thought that was really interesting.
So a lot of the jobs that are being replaced are service sector jobs, which you tend to find a high concentration of both people of color and women. Some of the other jobs, so it's interesting, a lot of the data around the impact of automation kind of highlights that it's going to have an extreme and disproportionate impact on Black males, because it's also going to affect labor sector jobs. And Black males tend to be concentrated in labor sector jobs.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, the next one is from another anonymous entry, so I'll read it out loud. For what types of initiatives do you see, I guess this is One Philadelphia,
Yep.
being most impactful and why?
So there's a couple of things that I see as being really impactful. One, now that we're pulling together partners across sectors, being able to take a holistic approach to a young person. So as an example, some of the partners that we're pulling in have nothing to do with tech. Some of the partners that we're pulling in are organizations that do literacy work, and they're organizations that do math and math support and tutoring, college access and college prep organizations. To be able to say we're going to look at the whole child and treat a young person in a very holistic way instead of what's been happening, which is like this very siloed, we don't have to think about anything else as long as we do this one thing. I think there's a lot of potential in what we're able to enable young people to do through that support. One of the other things we're doing, we're calling them community innovation coaches. We're starting out by training 40 people in neighborhoods throughout the city and basically putting them through a crash course in the tech and innovation ecosystem in Philadelphia. And they will be able to function almost as like block captains, but for tech and innovation in their communities. And they will be the people who are empowered to make sure that the 15-year-old understands what college majors are available to her, if she wants to go to school for tech, to make sure that the 30-year-old understands what PSL does and what Ben Franklin does. We want to really start empowering and enabling communities to really kind of push together and be a part of this. We're also going to be funding nonprofits. We're asking nonprofits to come together and collaborate. One of the most frustrating things for me as the CEO of a nonprofit is when people say you guys should work together and collaborate, but aren't willing to put money on the table to fund that collaboration. Collaboration costs money, partnerships cost money. So we're actually putting money on the table saying, okay, we need you to collaborate to be a part of this. How much does that cost? And we're going to write you a grant to fund it. We're also going to be funding startups. One of the most extreme issues for adults in the space is access to capital. So we're also saying, okay, we're putting up $100,000 of our money and asking other people to match that. And we're saying like, hey, we're going to, we have skin in the game. We're putting up $100,000 of our own money. Who wants to match that? And let's start putting capital in the hands of underrepresented founders that want to build scalable tech startups.
Yeah, and I as we keep coming back to that issue of, show me the money, to be perfectly honest, it's interesting because I feel like, and you can tell me if this is something you've encountered, that there's this resistance, like the almost unconscious resistance to paying for progress in the nonprofit world or paying for good things in the nonprofit world the same way you would pay for a boat, right? You wouldn't expect someone to build a boat for free. And a boat is a far more frivolous and less substantial thing than a young person's entire career. And yet we expect that to kind of take care of itself. Like, why can't you just collaborate and sort that out? Whereas the boat, it's like, well, of course, I'm going to pay you for it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's always like this really interesting and confusing way that people approach nonprofits, and it tends to have a really negative impact on underrepresented nonprofit leaders, because you get into this thing where people are saying like, well, you don't have the resources, and we don't believe that you can actually scale this and build this because you don't have the resources, so we're not going to fund you. But because you don't get the funding, you can't get the resources that you need to actually solve the reason why they're saying that they're not going to fund you. It's this interesting thing where it's like, well, we have to put money in the hands of people and put money on the table if we want them to be able to build that scalable thing.
Yep.
All right. There is a question from Hannah. I'm going to unmute you and allow you to ask it yourself. I actually have the same question.
Oh, I think that maybe it already got answered, but maybe this is a more direct version of this, which is what can I do to directly create change in my community towards this end?
So one, I would say, get politically engaged. Like, and what I was saying about tech companies isn't just for tech companies. We need to change policy. We need policy that enables and supports the work that we do in other organizations in this space. That policy change only happens with people like you who are willing to put pressure on your city council people, put pressure on your state senators and your state reps. And I tend to focus on the city and state level because that's where a lot of this happens. It only happens if people are like you are willing to get behind us and put that pressure on your elected officials. The other aspect of it is, we need people who are willing to go into communities and help get the word out. One of the problems we have in the city of Philadelphia is it doesn't matter what kind of education is going on if underrepresented people don't understand what the opportunities are, if they don't know what's available and they don't know how to access them. So, we need as many people as possible that are willing to 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 be advocates and willing to go into neighborhoods and help with that piece as well.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, the next question is from an anonymous attendee, so I will represent them. How do you think the tech industry and tech jobs come into play when talking about the issue of inequity over the next handful of decades?
I think that for a variety of reasons on a couple of different aspects or a couple of different sides, tech is going to be one of the largest drivers of either inequity or equity. Tech has the ability to be this amazing amplifier. The question is really, what is it going to amplify? If we can get people into jobs that we know are going to be sustainable and have upward, career opportunity, then we're able to amplify equity. If we choose not to, then it's just going to amplify the inequity. The other aspect to that is, if you think about some of the impacts of not having diverse technical teams, a lot of people are familiar with the issues with Google's facial recognition software and not being able to recognize the faces of Black people just because of the monolithic team that they had. If your entire team is white dudes and they feel like a white dude is a normal face, then that's what that algorithm is learning from. What a lot of people didn't know is the FBI was having the exact same problem as Google. So whereas Google is having that problem, it's not as serious of an issue as it is with the FBI if their facial recognition software is flagging the wrong people. That can then become a life or death situation. When you think about encounters that Black males especially, but also Black females have with law enforcement. More and more lending decisions, are being made with software. In the criminal justice system, we've already started to see people comparing the results of algorithms that are used to determine bail and determine things like parole, and people have already started to show like this is bias. This has the biases of the people who are making it. So I think that tech and the innovation space as a whole is going to be one of the largest drivers of either inequity or equity over the next few decades.
Just to double down on that, it's like you bring up an excellent point, because when we think of tech, we do tend to think of things like Google, Amazon, whatever, and there isn't a single industry, which includes lots of life and death industries, because the other one I think of is healthcare.
Yep.
All of healthcare is being run on tech now. And the people building that tech generally are white dudes. And you're seeing lots of inequity in health outcomes for Black and brown people, and especially for women. And that's not a coincidence. So absolutely, we need more women and people of color in all sectors of tech, because there is no sector of life that isn't going to be impacted by tech.
Yeah, and I definitely agree.
There's a question here from Tony about the types of skills that we're teaching, or that Coded by Kids is teaching. So I'm going to find you, Tony, and unmute you and let you ask your question.
Okay. I think I had typed a question prior to Sylvester making mention of people leaving his program and moving forward with starting a new venture. But my concern when I used to work in City Hall, and when I saw Coded by Kids, it sounded to me like we were teaching the most fundamental skills in computing. And I thought it was kind of akin to teaching people how to lay railroad tracks instead of teaching them how to drive trains. But you've also mentioned that you were funding and matching and going out into the community and all the rest of that. And I think that was the part that I didn't see.
Yeah, so I think one, I would push back on teaching software development being the most fundamental thing in tech. Just looking at salaries and income and growth opportunity, I would actually say it is by far not one of the most basic skills in computing. And I would point to the fact that the salaries and upward growth opportunity for software developers and software engineers bear that out. We were very deliberate in picking the things that we do teach based on what the upward mobility and upward economic growth opportunity were for those things, and intentionally stayed away from other things because it didn't have the same upward opportunity. But within that, teaching coding and teaching programming is only one aspect of what happens in Coded by Kids. We're teaching the technical skills, and a part of the technical skills, we also teach user experience design, user interface design. Our kids learn product management. At the same time, we're preparing them for higher education. We're not in the sense of the traditional sense of a workforce development program. We're not a workforce development program. For us, when kids graduate high school, the next step that we prepare them for is higher education. So they're majoring in a computer science, digital design, or tech-related major. We provide them with professional skills, and then the fourth pillar that we have is tech startup focused entrepreneurship. We have tech startup focused entrepreneurship as that last pillar because in underrepresented communities and Black and brown communities, there's a lot of stuff that teaches small business, but there's very few resources. There's very few programs that teach how do you start a true high growth, scalable tech startup. So those are the four pillars that we focus on, and all of those get integrated into our curriculum and our programs.
Okay.
You're not just teaching them to drive the train, you're teaching them to own the railroad.
Right.
Well,
Exactly.
I think it was the title of the program that got me. Because when I thought of coding, I thought of me fighting with JavaScript for 2 or 3 months and never knowing anything about that next step of what do we do with it. Thanks.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks, Tony. I was just going to say, like, exposing someone to a part of the tech industry, it kind of naturally exposes them to other parts of the tech industry. I started off as a designer, now I'm a project manager, now I lead the project management team. I know plenty of people that I work with day to day that used to be this and are now that, all in the tech realm. So it is the exposure to other things other than just what you're sitting down and doing, maybe.
Yeah, and so one of our kids, he junior in college and has made it clear, I want to be a product manager. You know, but he's been able to take all the other things that he's learned along the way and has said, like, I don't want to be a developer. Like, that's just not for me. I don't want to be a designer, but I really like product management and that's what I want to do. But he was only able to learn about product management through his exposure from everything else.
Sure. And even to be a great product manager, you need to understand business and technology together.
Yep.
And
Exactly.
the user, always the user. Okay, I'm gonna jump. So we are at 4:05. We have a little bit more time if everyone wants to hang on. There are quite a few more questions here to get through. This one is from, I believe it's pronounced Ali, so I will unmute you. Oh, he dropped, I think. This person dropped. So I'll read their question out loud. How might we assemble the collective expertise and action of Philly to address major long-term issues?
That is probably the easiest question for me to answer. Get involved with One Philadelphia. Reach out to us and get involved. Like that's an easy one.
And if we can drop the link in the chat one more time, just to remind.
Yeah. So onephl.org. And I can put it in there. I'm gonna pretend like I know how to use technology for a second.
The next question is, it's from another anonymous entry, but it's about the top 3 skills that Coded by Kids teaches. I feel like we did hit that. I don't know if there's anything else that you might want to say. I could read the full question. What are the top 3 skills Coded by Kids graduates come out with learning that will be the most helpful towards their careers?
Yeah, I mean, I think we touched on it. So I wouldn't point to like a top 3 skills. I would say that the top 3 things that we're doing is preparing them for higher education, which when people have looked at the top reasons why underrepresented people don't finish a computer science or tech related degree, one of the top reasons was lack of preparedness when they entered that degree program. So we want to remove that barrier by making sure that all of our young people are prepared. The second part, making sure that they have, the technical skills, but technical skills in the sense of understanding how these different parts fit together. People often ask me like, well, why don't you teach this language as opposed to that language? Or why don't you teach that? And one of the things I often say is like, for us, we're trying to teach them the foundation so that they can move in and out of languages. Like if one of our young people, by the time they hit college, is only good in one language, I would feel like I did a poor job at what I was supposed to be doing. And our young people who are in college who work for us will be the first ones to tell you, like, I'm often throwing new things at them and saying, like, you need to figure this out. Like, you should have enough of a foundation to figure out how this works. Like, okay, so you may not have ever used Python before. That's fine, but you still need to build this thing and you're going to do it in Python. So, figure it out and, let's move forward. That skill, being able to feel just comfortable saying like, I can figure it out. Like that in itself is a huge skill. But, then also having the understanding of how startups work and what it takes to run a startup, because you're able to then make an informed decision. And some of our young people have said, a startup isn't for me. Like, I have been able to learn enough about startups and I've been able to talk to enough people. That's not something I want to be a part of. That's not something I want to do. I just want to get a job. Hopefully Comcast will hire me. But knowing what it is you don't want, to me, that's something I didn't have when I graduated college. Like, I think many of us who are adults would have, really liked to have had the opportunity to figure out what we didn't want as we were working through careers.
It's hard to make a decision about what you want to do for the rest of your life at 18. And if you're asking folks to do it at 15 or whatever age they enter the program, I mean, kudos to them if they're capable of that.
And I try to always make the point that whatever you think you're going to be doing right now will change. Right? It's just
Totally.
that is the reality. Yeah, I'm 41 and I don't know what I want to be when I grow up.
I got an 11-year-old in the other room, and I will lay you good money that whatever he ends up doing doesn't exist right now.
Right. Yeah.
Well, he's very like progressive.
All
Still thoughtful little guy. All right. We have another anonymous question. I'll let you interpret it. How do you balance progress with keeping stakeholders happy?
I think that the progress is how you keep stakeholders happy, but also just setting expectations. Saying, hey, if you think that you're going to see this huge win happen in 3 months when we're trying to address something as deeply ingrained as inequity, like it's just not going to happen. We're going to set markers and milestones to show that we're moving in the right direction, but you have to be okay with not seeing a big win in a short period of time. And setting that expectation and being clear about that helps with, they're happy because they know what direction we're moving in.
You must have been a project manager in a past life. This question is from Aurelia. It doesn't look like she's on, so I will read it. Can you please give examples of service sector jobs and labor sector jobs?
So service sector jobs, a lot of jobs in healthcare, health home aides, things like that. A lot of jobs in retail, working at a cash register, working in a restaurant. It's interesting. You can go into some restaurants now and see that they put on tables a kiosk that you can order from. So now you're ordering from the kiosk that's on the table instead of an actual server. In the labor sector, if you look at the number of people required on a construction site to build and install an elevator today relative to the number of people you needed to build and install that elevator 5 years ago, it's almost been cut in half. And a lot of jobs on the labor side, a lot of jobs that you see on construction sites are more and more being replaced by some type of machinery.
All right. This next question is from Danica, but I believe she has dropped, so I will read it. The funding model that you were talking about with the Philadelphia School District, she's wondering if it's due to local taxes going to schools.
Yeah. So because white families were moving to the suburbs, that was then creating a greater tax base. Tying funding for schools to real estate taxes, it then ensured any area that had a higher tax base would always have better schools than an area that had a lower tax base, like the city of Philadelphia.
Right. Just a quick time check. It's 4:13. Are you all good to stay on? We have about 4 questions left.
I'm good.
I'm good.
Good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. This one is from another participant that dropped, so I will read it. Towards greater economic mobility and resilience, what do you see One Philadelphia's role as being?
Removing the silos and barriers that have traditionally stood in the way of that.
Right. Dean, you're on. You have 2 questions back to back. I'll let you hang on and ask as many of them as you'd like. There you go.
Here we go. Okay. Y'all can hear me?
Yes.
Yep, we can.
First of all, what's up, Sylvester? And
Hey, Dean.
and Dave, I went to one of your podcast seminars over at University of Science about 8 years ago. And how they doing? Of course, I've been around this stuff a long time. So I want to put some, I'm the old guy who's not afraid to put pressure on anybody, right? Because I've been around this stuff for a long time. And even I want to question, one question was, how do you get the city's institutions to kind of take what you're doing to partner with you, like SEPTA, PGW, PWD, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Philadelphia's IT department? All of them spend money on IT. All of them hire in IT. All of them have big budgets. You would think that would be like a perfect ecosystem to start, to take local trained people or even college students or interns to make sure that you always have a pipeline of 20 and 30 people that you can through your partners, that you can go ahead and people get some real experience early on in their careers, whether it's high school, community college, whatever.
Yeah,
So,
we've been able to build those same pipelines for
Mhm.
internships
Mhm.
through private companies and not have the same friction that you would have and the same bureaucracy that you would have trying to go through actual like city government institutions. And SEPTA is functions like a city government institution. So I mean, we're able to get have the same impact and same scale
Mhm.
without the same level of without the level of effort and friction that
Yeah.
comes with it.
Right. That was the reason why I asked the question, because if everyone who's claiming that the public officials and everyone's claiming about equity, then these are resources right here in our hands that always seem to be some form of resistance instead of being an enabler. And
Yep.
and another thing is that I'm always into kind of innovation, private sector. How do we do this without all the noise? So how do we build a competitive culture based incubator accelerator, so the talent, whether it's idea talent, tech talent, other talents, just like you have in AAU and other sports. How do we build something so we become a really competitive engine versus looking like that we are an entity looking to say, kind of a help us entity, when really we're a talent pool that with the right coaching and infrastructure, we could compete with anybody. So how
So,
do we culturally, how do we build this so we
so
change
that is,
change the narrative?
yeah, I mean, that is literally what we're doing, Dean. Like, so like if you look at what we're doing at the Coded by Kids level, where we're taking that sports approach,
Mhm.
the reason our mission is to prepare young people for leadership positions in tech
Mhm.
and not for jobs is
Mhm.
because we take that, how do we truly look at this from a high level, top tier talent perspective? And everything we do is geared towards that. At the adult side, we're actually launching as a part of the fund where I was talking about the $100,000 that we're putting up, that we're looking for matches for. We're actually launching an incubator and accelerator. The incubator leads into the accelerator, and it gives people who may not be ready for an accelerator the opportunity to gain the skills
Mhm.
necessary and acquire the education they need. And then once they successfully complete the incubator, they're able to move into the accelerator. And then when they successfully complete the accelerator, they can keep moving forward. But I mean, like a lot of that, to your point, are things that we are like literally building right now.
Okay, cool, that's good. Yeah, and I'm ready to volunteer, help, mentor. I like the incubator accelerator model. So I really like let's compete and get some things done, because we have the talent, and so whatever, COVID's here, 19 or whatever, but I'm sure it's not gonna be around forever, and need to get together and figure out how I can share some of my experiences and just become a servant to them out.
Yeah, definitely, always.
Okay, cool. All right, that's cool. I really appreciate this. It was nice.
Thanks so much, Dean.
Mhm.
And I'll put you back on mute. One last question, and then I will do a closing remark after, I guess, if either you, Sylvester or Dave, want to close. But here's the question. It's anonymous, so I will go ahead and read it. When local political groups sit at the opposite end of this ideology, in parentheses, opposite my ideology, what national organizations would you recommend we support who are making real political change versus the short-term unfixes you've been speaking to?
I'm actually recommending that people focus locally. As we've become more politically fractured and polarized, it's harder to move things that have real impact at the national level, but there's a ton of impact you can make focusing in on organizations at the state and local level. And I've really been pushing and encouraging people to focus locally to make the impact that they really want to see.
Yeah, and to your, we were chatting before about how you were telling me that the people who are less educated tend to be more politically active.
Right.
And what you just said sort of speaks to me of, gee, wouldn't it be great to get more educated people more politically active to kind of balance that out? So I agree, get politically active, and especially, locally.
Especially one of the things a lot of people don't realize, this isn't the comment I'm going to make isn't a political comment. It's a comment based on math. When you look at things mathematically, there's a higher ratio of Democrats in the United States than Republicans. If you then look at the political power that Republicans have, you can say just based on math that Republicans have an outsized sway politically, and the power that they yield is outsized relative to the percentage of the population that they make up. A part of that is, they've been very deliberate and strategic about how they approach state and local politics, and that control over state and local politics has enabled the Republican Party to do a lot of things that, and push through a lot of agendas that they've had. The power is really at the state and local level. I think sometimes we underestimate how much you can do and how much you can get done at that level.
And one last thing I'd like to say, was that the last question, Alina?
That was.
Yeah, so one last thing I'd like to say that just sort of you brought up when you were talking about the sports analogy. The reason that resonates is because I suspect part of the reason white America hasn't really had a trouble with the idea of empowering Black youth when it comes to sports and building all that pipeline around it is, there's a lot of money there, but I think the money came after just being able to get your head around, I can make money off of Black bodies. I mean, there's a very old stereotypical trope that, originates in slavery, that what Black people are good for is their bodies. It's a very dehumanizing, animalizing thing. And so it isn't that hard to make a leap to say, okay, you want to be empowered because you have this amazing physical gift. I can get my racist head around that. Right. But then say, oh no, that's, and yet not throw that kind of money against like an HBCU, which is really about Black intellect. That has historically been something that, white supremacy has resisted. So it's encouraging, I think. And there's an interesting contrast there between, what we're going to say is the thing to invest in long-term isn't Black bodies, it's Black intellect. And
right.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a completely different narrative and a completely different prospect. Even if you think about sports, people are willing to invest in Black bodies as players, but look who the owners are. Look who's managing the teams. Like, there's a huge disparity racially there. there's an interesting conversation that comes up from time to time when I'm talking to potential funders. And the minute I start talking about how we prepare our kids to be startup founders and preparing them for leadership positions, there are times when I get resistance from potential funders who are like, why would you want to prepare them for all that? And I can remember sitting in a meeting where a potential funder said to me, isn't getting your kids a job good enough? And like just that idea of why would we want to prepare Black kids for anything more than that? Like what you're talking about is crazy because you want them to do something more. Like that is very troubling, but it's also more common than you may think. And we tend to be very resistant to doing that. Now, I think I may have told you before, like the other thing that I get a lot of pushback on is how much money we spend on our programs for our kids. And I get a lot of pushback. People are like, your programs cost too much. You spend too much money on your kids. And I can remember having this conversation with someone and I asked them, I said, well, where do your kids go to school? His kids went to a very expensive private school. So my response was like, well, you obviously understand that a high quality education costs money. So why is it a problem when we want to spend the same kind of money to make sure that our kids have the same high quality education? Like, we get that resistance when we're saying, hey, we're going to do more than just allow them to be exploited or, allow them to do the bare minimum.
Wow. Well, thank you both so much, Sylvester and Dave. This has been enlightening, eye-opening, and inspiring for me personally. I really appreciated hearing everything that you both had to say. I think a lot of folks here, I was looking in the chat and there were a lot of minds blown and new information learned, and just like excitement around the topic and your motivation to challenge the status quo.